So I'm going to look at the emotional abuse decision tree, but I'm going to address it as what's common to all the decision trees, and then I won't be boring you with all of that stuff for the remaining 5 trees. So we use the first one as kind of the example in the template, and then I'll talk in the remaining 5 more about what the unique differences are, because that is the real key, that the definitions and what we did not, this is not meant to be interpreting the legislation or rewording the legislation, so we were extremely true to the definitions and the wording as they show up in the legislation, because that's the value of it. It's not my interpretation of the legislation or the licensees or the who thinks this is right or wrong. It's that we'll stick to the actual language that's used in the legislation, and you'll see the definitions do vary depending upon the kind, the label that goes with it. The other thing I would say is, and we also said to the licensees, using these decision trees, you don't have to label something that comes to your attention right off the bat as, oh, this is emotional abuse, so I'll go to the emotional abuse decision tree. You may well find that there are aspects of it that are verbal abuse, because often those are quite closely related, or you might find that something's physical abuse may also, you might need to look at the neglect decision tree. And so we say to people, don't be so quick to label. Look at the whatever it is that's come to your attention or that you've witnessed, and you might need to walk yourself through several decision trees. We'll look at them for the commonalities and for the unique differences. So we're looking at the emotional abuse one. So the common things is that just the structure of a decision tree or the flow chart, the way we used it, a box that's a rectangular square is an action or a statement, or a place that you come into the system or out of the system. Things that are diamonds are the key questions that either lead you down one path or down another path. And they always have at least 2 choices. Usually it's a yes choice, a no choice. Sometimes there's a third choice, which is actually the key part of the decision tree, is that third choice, the kind of the not sure yet choice. You will also see that in every of the decision trees there's a legend at the bottom, and the legend always keeps the reference to the legislation, the memos that were in the package to direct people back. And this really important point, and our legal really worked with us to have the exact right wording of this, and we hope we got pretty close, was that the requirement as people would go through the chart, that answers do not have to be definitive. So they don't have to know definitely black or white the answer to this question is yes, or definitely the answer is no. Now they may, which then will definitely lead them down a certain path or to a next question or to an action. But we always say if it's not a definitive, if it's not a black or white yes, and you'll see on most of the charts it's the yes answer that leads you down the more serious path, then you go with the yes. If it's a not quite sure whether it's yes or no, you go with the yes. Or in the situations where the no takes you down the more serious path, then and you're not quite sure, then you would go with the no, because you need to go down the more serious path. You need to go as far along the decision trees until you are sure. We also say to people that even right at the start, because the real question is always, are there reasonable grounds to suspect that this kind of abuse has occurred or may occur? So if you start out with reasonable grounds, I mean, if you're the person who will be reporting who has walked into a room and you saw somebody being abused, you witnessed, then you have more than reasonable grounds. Of course, you will continue and do an investigation, but you have reasonable grounds right at this point, and you immediately do what you need to do, including the immediate reporting. So what we're saying to people is, for the sake of learning and the sake of getting more comfortable with definitions, good idea to walk yourselves through the decision trees, but whatever point in the decision tree you end up having reasonable grounds to suspect, that's the point where you go to the reporting side. Okay, on every tree you will also see this little legal caveat that says the decision tree is intended as a guide, does not constitute legal advice, and reference back to the actual legislation. I think I actually skipped over that slide a little bit, and it's important. I really do need to go back. about the assumptions. Okay, that I talked about, it's the tool, but doesn't replace the need that the licensees understand, and the document that they have to go by is the legislation. That harm or risk of harm is implicit. And in the legislation, it talks about reporting things if that cause harm or risk of harm. We built that in, we didn't even ask that question in the decision trees because we made the assumption at the start, until you know better, if something comes to your attention that could possibly be abuse and neglect, until you know better, harm or risk of harm is always implicit in that. So we don't even ask the question. We say, you go to the decision tree. You don't say, well, was there harm, wasn't there harm? You know, through the decision tree, you might find out that there wasn't, and therefore then your action would be not to report but to address it internally because it came to your attention for some reason. And the definitive answers to the question, that's that you don't have to have the black and white, you keep going down the more serious path anyway. Okay, so, sorry, back to emotional abuse. Yes, and the key on this side, you'll see this on every one of the charts. This is the reporting sequence, and you can see it's the rectangle because it's the actions that are required to be taken. It's the immediately report, and this is where we actually put the pager number for 5 of the 6 require after hours notification if they come to attention. So this is the immediate reporting. And then the second box is the sequence to that. Remember I said the legislation says their final report after the full investigation has to be the 10 days. And however, there are situations, and we certainly understand that, where things can be really complex and they need to investigate and talk to a lot of people and, you know, and get lots of information, and maybe it's not possible to have that all in the 10 days. And so then this is the director's memo that says, well, then 21 days is the outside for that. And the mechanism through the ministry is this CIS system, critical incident reporting system. So now, remember I also said that we did not want the homes ever to forget that they must immediately act and respond and investigate. That's like this top box, and the whole sequence that would follow that would be all of those things about notifying proper people and calling police if they need, and doing their investigation, and they're immediately taking action to make sure people are safe. So that sits there. That's the parallel process that we want always people to be reminded about. Okay, let's walk through the emotional abuse one. Oh, the other thing I mentioned is nowhere on the trees do you see us saying then ignore it. Then you're okay, you don't have to do anything. No, because it came to your attention, something made it come to your attention. And so we have said it may not be something that's reportable under the legislation, under the definition, but the licensee manages through an internal process but need not report. So there is an expectation that it's not ignored. It may end up that it comes to nothing in terms of reporting, but that the licensee has to turn some attention to it. Okay, let's talk about emotional abuse. So you're the, and put ourselves in that different point of view. It's like the movie set. So we're now the point of view of the person in the long-term care home. Somebody's come to them and said, I suspect, or I think, or I witnessed that a resident was emotionally abused. So then to decide about reporting, remember the basic reason for these charts is to help the licensees decide what they need to report to the ministry. So the basic question, are there reasonable grounds to suspect that emotional abuse has occurred or may occur? Now, it would be pretty rare for somebody to be able to go down that no path right away, because how do you know? You don't really know. In emotional abuse, it's not as if somebody, you know, that there's blood that you're looking at, heaven forbid. But so emotional abuse, you know, it's not obvious. It may not be obvious. So usually they wouldn't go down that no path. So let's not go down that no path for this chart. Now, if right away they have reasonable grounds, this is where the yes comes in, and the big thick yes line leads them directly. Then you report it right now and follow this reporting path. However, for the exercise, for the learning exercise as well, we want people, because there were lots of people that were making this jump without understanding the definitions in between. So let's say we're not sure, to be determined. And so the orangey red box is their alert. They're kind of, then, you know, the flashing light, keep going. So, but notice it doesn't say, then this is the only question you have to ask. Here's your next question, and this is really the meat of where the definitions get broken down so that there's a logical sequence of the this, then this, then this, then this. Did a resident, so this is what I call the whodunit column on all of the decision trees. Was it a resident who made threatening or intimidating gestures, actions, behavior, or remarks to another resident? So if this is resident to resident, we're going to say in this case, yes, it was. Yes, it was one resident, but notice it doesn't say, well, then you report it immediately. Next question, in next part of the definition, did it cause alarm or fear to another resident? So you might have two residents who've been neighbors in the community, same, you know, meet at the grocery store, josh around, they have this way of speaking to each other that somebody listening to might think that's not kind of the way I'd like to talk to somebody else, but it's the way they are and the way they talk. So the recipient of that, that's the way they've always been. And so that other resident is not alarmed or fearful. So if that was just that one case of those two people, then the answer would be no, it didn't cause alarm or fear. Well, so then it doesn't meet the definition to report to the ministry. Remember, I'm not saying it doesn't meet a requirement to do something. It does mean that it doesn't meet the requirement to report to the ministry. And so we would expect that the licensee to look at that and maybe, you know, maybe be talking and making sure that, like, that's their way, or if it's, you know, or if there are other factors or whatever to deal with those. But let's say, no, maybe it didn't cause alarm to that person, but maybe it happens at the dining table. And so it might not be the person that the comment or whatever is addressed to, but that in fact it's disturbing all the other people at the table, and they're quite fearful, and they think this guy's not just joshing, or they don't know this guy's joshing around. And so then the answer would be yes. But notice again, it doesn't say, well, then that's reportable right away. Here is a key point, and it shows up on this emotional abuse and the verbal abuse definition, but none other. And I will emphasize that, and you'll see why on the other charts. This, did the resident performing the gesture, actions, behavior, or remarks understand and appreciate their consequences? Those two decision definitions are the only ones that take into account, that make any allowance, let's say, for cognition, okay? But so if the answer is no, the resident doing it doesn't appreciate and understand the consequence, then the licensee does not ignore, but that would be something addressed probably through their behavior supports, through the best practices that they should be seeking out and using about how to deal with and support people with behaviors. However, if the person is able to understand and so you can understand that it's intentional what they're doing, then the answer is yes, and that is a reporting as emotional abuse. Okay, we're going to go back to the whodunit. So that's a resident-to-resident situation. Let's go back to the whodunit column. Was it a resident? No, it wasn't a resident. So it was somebody else. Expectation of behavior is higher if it's somebody else. And so you will see the actual definition of what emotional abuse would be like is expanded. So if it's anybody else, if it's staff, if it's family, if it's volunteer, if it's anybody else, did anyone ever, than a resident, then yes it was, make threatening, insulting, intimidating or humiliating gestures, actions, behavior, or remarks which may include imposed social isolation, shunning, ignoring, lack of acknowledgement, or infantilization. So you see that the expectation of behavior is, of course, as it should be, higher. And therefore, if it's not a resident doing that, then then it immediately, and there are no other ifs, ands, or buts about it, then that would be reportable as emotional abuse. If through investigation, and now we also say to the licensee is, this decision tree is not something to walk through in 3 days. This decision tree is meant to be like a 2 or 3 minute exercise that you do on the best of the information you have at the moment. Because that parallel that you're investigating and all the rest of that along may take you along a different path. You may end up finding out that you made some yes answers here that in fact were no in the situation, but then what they are required to do is say, we send in this incident, this is our investigation, this is what it is showing, and and then that closes off that report. So, but people need to be reporting, and then if they find differently, then they can report that back. So they're not expected to hold on to this and go, okay, well in 3 days we'll decide to report. No, this is a quick mental exercise, go through in a couple of minutes and take your action of the time. So that's the emotional abuse one.